boardroom gleamed with cold precision, every surface polished to a reflective perfection that mirrored the skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass walls. Sunlight streamed in from the city below, casting long, angular shadows across the expensive oak table where Harrison Montgomery sat, commanding the attention of a dozen of the nation's most influential investors. His dark suit was immaculately tailored, his posture rigid, the lines of authority etched across his face. Every word he spoke was measured, precise, and devoid of hesitation, an unspoken reminder that in this room, decisions mattered more than sentiment. Elizabeth Montgomery sat beside him, her expression carefully composed, lipstick immaculate, pearls catching the light as she nodded politely at the investors' compliments. Her gaze, however, occasionally flickered toward the corner where her son sat, a small figure in a custom wheelchair, his body tense, fingers trembling. William Montgomery, 6 years old, cerebral palsy twisting the smooth lines of his movements, watched the room with wide, intelligent eyes. His lips quivered, attempting to form sounds that rarely became words, and now they erupted into piercing screams that cut across the room like a shard of glass. No one turned. The investors exchanged polite smiles, murmured agreements about projections and quarterly gains, and Harrison waved a hand distractedly. "He'll tire himself out," he said, voice calm, almost rehearsed as if he were discussing a minor inconvenience rather than his own son's desperate cries. Elizabeth's lips tightened, a practiced smile in place, her body angled subtly away from William, a silent signal to the child that his urgency could be safely ignored. The room thrummed with wealth and power, but it was a power that had learned to ignore discomfort, inconvenience, anything that threatened its polished surface. From her vantage point near the back of the room, Lily Carter watched. 10 years old, small for her age, her hands smudged from cleaning supplies, hair pulled into a practical braid, she crouched behind the buffet table where she'd been sent to wipe the corners before the meeting. Her eyes, bright and perceptive, were fixed on William. There was something different in the way he screamed, sharp, urgent, not the erratic outburst of a child seeking attention. Lily's intuition, sharpened by years of observing unnoticed patterns, whispered that he was trying to tell someone something vital. Her stomach knotted with a mixture of fear and curiosity. William's hands shook violently, one of them jerking toward the glass wall, toward the dizzying height of the city below. His lips formed shapes guttural and broken, as if the words existed in a secret code only someone willing to see beyond his paralysis could understand. Yet no one leaned down, no one leaned in. The investors continued their discussions about mergers and interest rates, oblivious to the child whose entire body was straining to be heard. Harrison adjusted his cufflinks, smiled at a nodding associate, and repeated almost absently, "Just ignore it. Nothing to be done." The tension in the room grew heavier with every second. William's face reddened, tears streaking the contours of his cheeks. His screams now mingled with whimpers, a melody of desperation that went unanswered. Lily shifted slightly, pressing her hands together, instinctively inching closer, careful to remain unseen. She could see the intensity in his eyes, the way they darted toward something important, something the room's occupants were too distracted to notice. Her heart pounded. Something was about to happen, she knew it, and the adult's blindness made it worse. Elizabeth glanced at William again, this time with a hint of annoyance, and whispered, "Harrison, please, he's drawing attention." Harrison's response was a dismissive shake of his head, but his eyes flickered ever so briefly toward his son, a flash of impatience and detachment. Lily's gaze followed William's trembling hand, tracing the silent signal he desperately tried to send. The polished walls of the boardroom, the clinking of glasses, the air scented with fresh coffee and power. All of it stood in stark contrast to the silent alarm he was trying to raise. And in that disparity, the first seed of suspense took root. Something crucial was coming, and only those willing to truly see could prevent it. William's screams cut again, raw and urgent, echoing off the glass. Lily's mind raced, and she leaned slightly, whispering under her breath, "I hear you. I'll see." The adults remained oblivious, but Lily had chosen to notice. The game had begun, and the balance of helplessness and courage teetered on the edge of a single, impending revelation. The moment William's hand twitched toward the massive glass atrium, the boardroom seemed to shrink around him, the polished walls closing like a cage. His small body quivered violently, and the guttural sounds that had always been dismissed as meaningless suddenly carried a pulse, a rhythm of desperation that made Lily's stomach twist. She crouched lower behind a gleaming credenza, her fingers clutching the edge as though holding onto a lifeline, watching the boy's gaze sharpen and lock on a spot near the atrium floor. Something was there, something urgent, and William knew it. Lily's breath caught. She had never seen such raw, urgent clarity in a child so dismissed, so underestimated. Harrison leaned back in his chair, flipping through a report as though the world beyond those pages, beyond the polished marble floor, did not exist. The investors nodded, unaware, sipping their expensive coffee, their attention absorbed by charts and numbers. Elizabeth's fingers fluttered across her tablet, scrolling through emails with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime maintaining appearances. Neither noticed the tremor in William's body, the way his wheelchair seemed almost to shift forward as if propelled by invisible energy. His eyes darted frantically, darted toward the atrium again and then back to the adults, pleading for comprehension that would never come from them. And yet, there was Lily. Hidden in the shadows, she watched. Her small chest rose and fell with rapid breaths, her mind a storm of conjecture and fear. The sharp edges of her curiosity cut through the fear. She had to know what he was trying to say. She had to act, slowly, deliberately. She slid across the floor, silent as a shadow, staying behind the long legs of the boardroom chairs. Every step made her pulse spike. A creak from the polished floor would give her away, and the adults would dismiss everything in an instant. But something in William's eyes, a blaze of silent alarm, pulled her forward. William's right hand jerked again, pointing toward the atrium, toward a narrow, raised walkway that led above a shallow ornamental water fountain. Lily's gaze followed and her stomach knotted. Something small, fragile, maybe a child, was teetering on the edge, its tiny frame nearly invisible beneath the glare of sunlight reflecting off the glass. The realization hit her in a pulse of ice-cold fear. If she didn't move, this child could fall, and none of the adults, trapped in their world of power and business, would even notice until it was too late. The tension coiled tighter in the room. William's screams had become a low, urgent chant, vibrating through the air like a warning bell. The investors glanced nervously, exchanging puzzled looks, but no one approached him. Harrison tapped his pen impatiently, muttering something about attention-seeking behavior, while Elizabeth's polished smile faltered for the tiniest moment, a crack in the veneer of social perfection. Lily crouched lower, her mind racing. She couldn't call attention to herself. Security was strict, and a child wandering in the middle of a corporate boardroom could be stopped immediately. Every instinct screamed for her to freeze, to hide, but every fiber of her being pulled her toward the danger William had detected. She slid toward the glass wall, her reflection merging with the city skyline in the window, her small figure ghost-like against the towering lights of the city. She could see it clearly now. A little girl, barely 3, dressed in a bright yellow dress, clinging precariously to the narrow ledge of the atrium platform. Her tiny fingers were slick with condensation from the fountain below, her legs wobbling as she teetered. Lily's heart slammed against her ribs, but William's gaze guided her, unspoken and insistent. The boy who had been dismissed, underestimated, ignored, he had known. A bead of sweat ran down Lily's temple as she edged closer, her hands ready to catch the child if she fell. The polished conference room behind her buzzed with oblivion. Investors discussed mergers. Harrison's voice boomed over projected figures, and Elizabeth continued to type, none aware that life balanced on a knife's edge just steps away. The suspense tightened, coiling like a spring until the moment hung frozen. One wrong move and disaster would strike. Then Lily whispered almost to herself, "I see you. I've got you." And with the precision of courage fueled by fear and determination, she made her move. The invisible chain of trust between William's silent intelligence and her daring action, pulling her toward a moment that would change everything. Lily's heart pounded so violently she feared it might betray her, the rapid thud echoing in her ears as she edged closer to the narrow atrium ledge. The city sprawled beneath the glass walls, sunlight glinting off the buildings in sharp, dazzling streaks, but all she could see was the tiny, teetering figure of the girl in yellow. The child's head bobbed precariously, her curls brushing against the metal railing that was too low, too flimsy to offer real protection. Every instinct screamed for Lily to freeze, to retreat, to wait for one of the oblivious adults to notice. But William's eyes burned in her memory, urging her forward. She shifted her weight carefully, inching along the polished atrium floor. The echo of the boardroom behind her, laughter, murmurs, clinking glasses, felt surreal, a grotesque soundtrack to the life-or-death drama unfolding mere feet away. Lily could feel William's desperation as if it were her own, the way his small hand had trembled, the sharp focus in his eyes. It was as though he had sent her a silent plea through a thread invisible to everyone else. She whispered softly, "I've got you. Just stay still," though she knew the child couldn't hear her. The little girl wobbled again, tiny arms flailing instinctively. Lily's breath caught, every muscle in her body tense, ready to spring. A cold trickle of fear ran down her spine and she almost faltered. But then she remembered William, silent but commanding, every gesture a lifeline. He had seen it, had known what was coming, and he had been powerless to intervene. Lily's resolve hardened. She would not fail him. Not this time. As she moved closer, the sunlight caught the yellow dress in a flash, making it look almost aflame against the metallic gray of the atrium. The child's small foot slipped, teetering dangerously over the edge, and Lily lunged, sliding her hands under the tiny torso just as gravity began to claim it. For a heartbeat, time stretched and warped. The boardroom chatter was a distant, meaningless hum, and all that existed was the fragile life in her arms, the boy who had warned her, and the peril hovering beneath them. She held the child close, knees bent, heart racing, and slowly inched back to the safety of the atrium floor. Relief surged so violently it was almost painful. The little girl's eyes fluttered open, wide and frightened, and Lily murmured reassurances, rocking her gently, careful not to let her panic transfer. It was only then, from the shadowed edge of the atrium, that Lily noticed him again. William silent now, his tears-streaked face pale but triumphant in a quiet, unacknowledged victory. The boy had communicated a threat no adult had seen, no one had believed, and yet his intuition and intelligence had guided the rescue. His small frame seemed to swell with a quiet dignity, an invisible crown of awareness and foresight, while the adults remained trapped in their world of oblivion. Harrison Montgomery's booming voice suddenly broke through the haze of adrenaline. "What in God's name is happening?" he barked, his eyes narrowing as he finally noticed the commotion near the atrium. Elizabeth appeared beside him, her composure cracking, the color draining from her perfectly made-up face as she caught sight of her daughter, safe in Lily's arms. Gasps rose from the boardroom as staff and investors alike turned, their polite facades shattered by the stark reality they had ignored for minutes, maybe hours. Lily stepped forward, cradling the child tightly, and caught Harrison's gaze. His expression flickered from disbelief to rage to stunned realization as he followed her line of sight. And then impossibly he understood. The boy, the paralyzed, overlooked child who had screamed and gestured, dismissed and invisible, had known exactly what was happening. He had communicated danger in a way no one else had bothered to comprehend. "William," Harrison whispered almost to himself, stepping toward the wheelchair. He had no words for what he had ignored, no excuse for the blindness that had almost cost a child her life. Elizabeth reached out, trembling, and touched her son's shoulder, as if suddenly aware that all the world's polish, wealth, and sophistication could not replace true attention, true care. Meanwhile, Lily stood quietly, the adrenaline fading into a strange mixture of relief, exhaustion, and awe. She had acted on instinct, on observation, on courage, but it was William who had guided her every step. And in that moment she realized that sometimes the loudest voice is not the one everyone hears. Sometimes it is the silent, unseen warning that holds the power to change everything. The room remained tense, shocked into silence. Investors murmured, unsure where to look. Staff hovered at the edges, whispering. But in the center, in the quiet eye of the storm, William's eyes met Lily's. No words were needed. The understanding passed between them, unspoken and profound. The danger had been averted. The world had almost ignored him, but this time someone had listened. And that alone was a revelation that would ripple far beyond the atrium, far beyond the boardroom, far beyond the polished walls of the Montgomery Empire. The boardroom felt suddenly suffocating, the polished marble and glass walls now oppressive as though they were closing in on everyone inside. Whispers ricocheted off the floor-to-ceiling windows, the stunned murmurs of investors mixing with the heavy breathing of the staff. And yet Harrison Montgomery stood frozen, staring at his son as though seeing him for the very first time. William, small in his wheelchair, sat with hands trembling, eyes sharp and wide. the silent triumph of a messenger whose warnings had been ignored almost to catastrophe. Elizabeth hovered by his side, her hand frozen over her lips, a mixture of guilt and disbelief clouding her perfect composure. She had smiled, nodded, pretended to care, all the while dismissing her son's intelligence, his frustration, his urgent need to be heard. And now, standing in the aftermath of near tragedy, the truth pressed against her chest like a weight too heavy to ignore. Lily held Emily carefully, her small body taut with adrenaline, yet she did not flinch. Her gaze shifted to William, and she saw something that the adults had missed: intelligence, awareness, and a fierce determination that had no need for words. She whispered softly, "He knew. He knew it was coming." Her voice was barely audible over the rising panic, but to William it carried understanding, recognition, and above all, the validation he had rarely received. Harrison's face hardened, a storm of denial and fear, battling beneath the surface of his meticulously composed expression. This isn't possible," he said, his voice tight, brittle with tension. "He can't communicate clearly. He broke off, swallowing, unable to finish the thought. The words felt inadequate, meaningless. All the money, all the prestige, all the doctors, the therapists, the high-tech equipment. They had done nothing to reveal the truth that a child he had dismissed had known instinctively. Lily stepped forward, her small hand trembling slightly as she placed Emily safely on a nearby chair. "He was trying to tell you," she said firmly, looking Harrison directly in the eye. "He knew something was wrong. He was screaming, pointing. You weren't listening." A cold silence fell over the room. Even the investors seemed to shrink back, their polished confidence faltering in the face of a raw, undeniable reality. Harrison's jaw clenched as he studied his son. William's small hands rested lightly on the wheels of his chair, fingers still trembling. Eyes locked on the man who had failed to see him, not as a child in a wheelchair, but as someone who could perceive, understand, and warn. Elizabeth finally spoke, voice quivering. I thought he just wanted attention. I didn't realize." The words trailed off into nothingness, leaving only the weight of regret hanging between them. The child they had underestimated, whose communication they had ignored, had been right all along. Lily swallowed hard, sensing that the moment demanded courage beyond her 10 years. She moved closer to William's side, offering him a quiet solidarity. "You told me," she said, voice low, almost reverent. "You told me and I listened. I saw." William's lips twitched in the smallest semblance of a smile, a fleeting acknowledgement of the bond they now shared. Two children, invisible in different ways, yet connected by perception and bravery. Harrison's hands trembled, an unusual vulnerability in a man so accustomed to control. The room seemed to tilt, the clinking glasses, murmured reassurances, and polite smiles of investors fading into the background. All that remained was the undeniable fact: his son had seen, had known, had warned, and he had failed to listen. A sharp knock at the door startled everyone. The security staff hesitated, unsure whether to enter, and Harrison waved them off weakly. The boardroom, once a temple of power and authority, now felt hollow, exposed, stripped of its illusions. Every person in the room sensed the shift, the moral earthquake that had rippled through polished surfaces and corporate pretense. Lily's gaze shifted from William to Harrison. "You almost lost her," she said quietly, referring to Emily. "He tried to tell you, don't make the same mistake again." Her words, though soft, cut through the tension like a blade. For the first time, Harrison truly saw his son, not as a problem to manage or an inconvenience to overlook, but as a human being capable of perception, foresight, and heroism. And as the silence stretched, as the adults grappled with shame and disbelief, the first real cracks began to form in the carefully constructed armor of the Montgomery Empire. The physical danger had passed, but the emotional and moral reckoning had only just begun. Outside, the city sparkled indifferently beneath the glass, unaware that in one boardroom, the world of power had been humbled by the courage and intelligence of the overlooked. The aftermath of the rescue left the boardroom suspended in a kind of tense disbelief, as if every polished surface and elegant chair were suddenly alien, irrelevant in the wake of near catastrophe. Harrison Montgomery stood rigidly by the glass wall, hands pressed against the cold surface, staring down at the city below as if searching for answers in the streets beneath him. He had always believed he understood everything, the markets, power, influence, but he had never truly understood his own son. Not William. Not until now. Elizabeth hovered near the desk, her fingers twisting the hem of her silk blouse, a gesture betraying the storm behind her carefully maintained composure. She had prided herself on control, appearances, the ability to manage everything around her, but nothing could manage this. Nothing could undo the moment when her daughter Emily had almost slipped into the abyss and the truth she had refused to acknowledge hit her with the force of a hammer. William had known. He had seen the danger when no one else had. Lily stood near the atrium ledge, holding Emily close, her small frame trembling from adrenaline but her eyes bright and unyielding. She had acted on instinct, on courage, on a connection with a boy most of the world refused to see. And now she could feel the weight of every gaze on her. Harrison's, Elizabeth's, the investors, the staff, all of them suddenly aware that they had ignored a child whose insight had saved a life. Harrison turned slowly toward Lily, his face a storm of disbelief and fragile authority. You found her?" he demanded, his voice sharp. But beneath it was a tremor of something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. How did you know?" "I listened," Lily said simply, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I listened to him." She gestured toward William, whose small hands rested lightly on the arms of his wheelchair, his gaze fixed on the polished floor, the tiniest flicker of acknowledgement crossing his face. He was trying to tell everyone. No one was listening except me. Harrison's jaw tightened, and for a moment the room felt as if it were holding its breath. The weight of denial pressed against him like an invisible hand. He had always dismissed William's struggles, rationalized the boy's limited communication as incapacity, as a problem that could be managed but never understood. And now the undeniable truth slammed into him. William's mind, his awareness had been underestimated, and the consequences could have been catastrophic. Elizabeth's voice quavered as she spoke, sharp with shame and guilt. "Harrison, we should have..." Her words stumbled and fell, inadequate in the face of the raw reality before them. She stepped closer to William, reaching out instinctively as though her touch could somehow erase the negligence of the past. But William did not flinch. He did not shrink. His eyes, wide and intelligent, met hers, and for the first time he was seen, fully and unambiguously. The tension in the room thickened, palpable and suffocating. Investors shifted uncomfortably. The staff exchanged hushed murmurs, but no one spoke the words that now lingered unuttered. Neglect, underestimation, the moral cost of ignoring truth. Lily, sensing the fragile balance, stepped closer to William's wheelchair.
"He tried to warn you," she said, her voice low but cutting through the silence.
"You ignored him. He wasn't screaming for attention. He was screaming to save someone's life." Harrison's fingers dug into the edge of the glass, knuckles white. A strange, raw emotion flickered across his face. Anger, yes, but also recognition, shame, disbelief. His mind raced, a storm of calculations and projections unable to solve the simplest, most human equation. He had failed to see the child who had known more than anyone in the room. For the first time, the boardroom was no longer a stage of control and power. It had become a crucible, testing the limits of pride, understanding, and morality. William, silent now, remained at its center, his small body a paradox of fragility and perceptive strength, and Lily standing beside him, a bridge between what was unseen and what demanded attention, held the key to the revelation that would unravel more than just a near tragedy. Then, almost imperceptibly, William raised his hand, trembling but deliberate, and pointed toward a gap in the atrium railing, toward the small section of the floor where shadows hinted at another potential hazard. The room froze. The investors stiffened. Harrison and Elizabeth exchanged a glance that was all fear and realization. Lily whispered, her eyes fixed on William's. "He's not done. He's showing us there's more. We need to pay attention." And in that instant, a chilling awareness descended over the room. The danger had been averted, yes, but the consequences of ignorance, of blind pride and dismissal, were far from over. William had spoken in the only language he had, and finally someone had listened. But the reckoning was just beginning, and its impact would echo far beyond the walls of polished glass and cold marble. The boardroom had fallen into a tense, suffocating silence. Even the city beyond the glass walls, usually alive with the hum of traffic and the distant sirens of life, seemed muted, holding its breath along with those inside. Harrison Montgomery stood rigid, one hand pressed against the polished table, knuckles white, the other hovering midair as if unsure whether to reach or retreat. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, a suffocating clarity that he had failed not only as a parent but as a human being capable of seeing what was right in front of him. William sat in his wheelchair, trembling slightly, the faintest trace of a satisfied glow in his eyes. He had guided Lily to the danger, saved a life through sheer perception, yet he remained unseen by most of the adults in the room. His hands shook as he rested them on the chair's arms, fingers twitching in tiny, precise gestures. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, and yet almost impossible for anyone untrained to interpret. And that was precisely why the tension in the room was so sharp. The adults now realized with a sinking horror that they had ignored the warnings of someone far more perceptive than they had ever given him credit for. Elizabeth's face was pale, her usually impeccable posture crumpled, a silent testament to the shame clawing at her insides. She stammered, words trailing into the dense air, failing to capture the magnitude of their negligence. She swallowed hard and glanced at Harrison, whose gaze remained fixed on William, searching for answers, for proof that what he had dismissed as a child's frustration was in fact truth. Lily, still holding Emily, felt the electric tension of the room like a live wire running through her small body. She stepped closer to William, whispering softly, "He needs you to understand. Look at him." William's hand twitched again, this time more urgently, pointing toward the far corner of the atrium where a shadowed platform jutted precariously over the fountain below. It was subtle, easily missed, but Lily's sharp eyes caught it immediately. Harrison's pulse quickened. His eyes followed William's gesture and landed on the shadowed platform, and suddenly the pieces of the puzzle slashed through his mind like lightning. The near fall, the screams, the desperate pointing, they were all warnings, all signs, all missed signals of danger that could have had a far worse ending. His chest tightened. He had dismissed his son's intelligence, treated his gestures as meaningless, and almost allowed tragedy to strike. The weight of realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth as she finally noticed the shadow, the platform, the potential hazard William had been signaling. "Oh God," he saw it, she whispered, voice trembling. Every polished facade, every carefully curated impression, every act of social performance melted away in the face of the undeniable truth. William had known, and they had ignored him. The suspense stretched taut in the room. Investors shuffled uneasily, some whispering, some frozen in shock as the true magnitude of what had been averted became clear. The adults had been blind, their pride and distraction nearly catastrophic. Lily moved even closer to William, crouching slightly beside his wheelchair. "He saw danger no one else did," she said quietly, her voice firm and unwavering, and he made sure it was stopped. "You need to listen." For the first time, Harrison's armor cracked. His eyes welled, and his voice, usually sharp and commanding, faltered. "William, I didn't see. He trailed off, swallowed by the shame that had been building in him for years of overlooking his son. He bent slightly, bringing himself to William's level, and in that moment the boardroom ceased to exist as a temple of power. It became a place of reckoning, humility, and recognition. William's lips quivered, and he raised his hand again, pointing not to danger this time, but toward the adults, as though demanding acknowledgement, demanding respect for the truth he had conveyed. Lily watched as Harrison's eyes followed the gesture, and a slow, fragile understanding began to form. The boy in the wheelchair had not been a passive observer, nor had he been a helpless child. He had been the sentinel, the guide, the unseen protector, and now finally his voice, though silent, though gestured, was being heard. Elizabeth knelt beside her son, tears streaking her face, her perfectly composed image shattered, replaced by raw, unfiltered emotion. "I am so sorry, William," she whispered, voice breaking. "I should have listened. I should have always listened." Harrison reached out, placing a trembling hand over hers, his other hand hovering uncertainly above William's shoulder. Silence enveloped the room, heavy with remorse and awe. And then, almost imperceptibly, William's eyes flicked toward Lily. In that quiet glance, an entire conversation passed. Gratitude, recognition, and a bond forged in crisis. The boy who had been ignored, underestimated, and silenced had guided a small girl to avert catastrophe. And together, they had revealed the truth adults had refused to see. The boardroom remained still, the city outside glimmering indifferently under the afternoon sun, but inside the air had shifted irreversibly. The adults had been humbled, the child had been recognized, and the young girl had proven that courage and perception could override neglect and privilege. The shocking truth, now undeniable, hung in the room like a storm cloud. William had been right all along, and the reckoning for those who ignored him had only just begun. The room was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that presses on the chest and makes every heartbeat thunder in the ears. Outside, the city glimmered as if oblivious to the near tragedy that had unfolded just above the streets. Inside the Montgomery boardroom, the polished marble floors and glass walls reflected not power or prestige, but the raw, unvarnished truth. Pride, wealth, and control were meaningless when a child's life hung in the balance. Harrison Montgomery remained at William's side, trembling slightly, a man unmoored by the enormity of his own failure. He had prided himself on seeing everything, on controlling everything, yet he had been blind to the intelligence, the perception, the courage of his own son. William, small and trembling, sat in his wheelchair with an intensity that now demanded recognition. His hands had guided Lily, had warned them all, and yet no one had listened. Not until it was almost too late. Elizabeth's face was pale, tear-streaked, a mask of perfection shattered forever. She knelt beside William, brushing his hair back gently, her lips trembling as she whispered apologies that felt both insufficient and infinitely overdue. "I should have seen," she murmured, voice cracking. "I should have listened. I failed you." For the first time, the weight of her social performance and perfectionism collided violently with reality, leaving her stripped bare in front of her son and the room. Lily, standing protectively near Emily, felt the tension tighten around her like a living thing. She could see the shifting storm inside Harrison, the fragility in Elizabeth, the silent triumph in William, and then, as if responding to her own unspoken thoughts, William's small hand rose, pointing once more, not toward danger this time, but toward the corner of the atrium floor, where another detail now came sharply into focus. Lily followed his gesture with wide eyes and froze. There, partially hidden beneath the decorative plants, was a small unattended glass container, an overturned vase that had rolled close to the edge of the atrium, precarious enough to spill and cause injury if someone stepped there without noticing. It was minor compared to what had almost happened, but it was proof. William had seen danger before it became apparent, had tried to communicate it in ways no one had understood. And now, finally, someone was paying attention. Harrison's breath hitched as he knelt beside William, eyes searching the boy's face for understanding, for guidance, for forgiveness. You tried to tell us," he said, voice barely above a whisper. His words trembled with a mixture of awe, guilt, and fear. "All this time, I thought you couldn't." He stopped, swallowed hard, the enormity of his oversight crashing over him. Lily stepped forward, her small hands raised slightly in an instinctive gesture of reassurance. "He can see things. He notices everything. He tells us in his own way. You have to trust him," she said, voice steady, carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed courage firsthand. Elizabeth's tears fell freely now, unrestrained as she finally leaned into her son, holding his hands gently. "We were blind," she admitted, voice cracking with remorse. "Blind to you, blind to what mattered." William's eyes flicked to Lily, and in that quiet exchange, a world of understanding passed. The boy who had been dismissed, who had been underestimated, had been the true hero of the day, and the girl who had believed in him had amplified that heroism, turning it into life-saving action. For a long moment, the room was still. The investors murmured quietly. The staff exchanged looks, but all of it seemed secondary to the moral and emotional reckoning playing out at the center. Harrison straightened slowly, his face pale but set with a new kind of resolve. "We've been wrong," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of acknowledgement and newfound humility. "Blind to what's important. Blind to him. He gestured toward William, whose small hands now rested calmly on the wheelchair, but no longer. The tension broke gradually like a dam giving way. The adults began to act, not as masters of a polished empire, but as parents, as humans finally willing to see. Elizabeth gathered William into her lap gently, cradling him, and Harrison knelt beside them, reaching out to rest a tentative hand on his son's shoulder. Lily, standing tall despite her exhaustion, felt a quiet pride, a tremor of joy at being part of this revelation. And then, almost imperceptibly, William's lips curved into the smallest, faintest smile, the kind that spoke of triumph, recognition, and vindication. He had communicated what no one else could see. He had guided action, prevented tragedy, and forced even the most powerful adults in the room to confront their own blindness. The world, polished and indifferent, had finally been made to notice him. Outside, the city continued its indifferent hum, unaware of the drama that had unfolded above it. Inside, the boardroom had changed irreversibly. The polished floors and glass walls reflected more than wealth. They reflected courage, awareness, and the extraordinary power of listening to the quiet, overlooked voices. And in the center of it all, a boy in a wheelchair and a small girl who had dared to believe in him stood victorious, their unspoken bond a testament to bravery, empathy, and the life-saving force of truly seeing.